The rain began as a whisper against the glass walls of Reed Enterprises, a tower of steel and mirrors that touched the clouds. From the 50th floor, Alexander Reed, one of the richest men in the city, stood silently, his eyes fixed on the grey storm outside. Raindrops slid down the glass like falling tears, cold, quiet and without emotion. Inside his office, everything shone. The marble floor, the expensive art, the golden clock that ticked without mercy. Yet amidst all this beauty, the air felt empty. Alexander's reflection in the window looked sharp and powerful, a man the world envied. But beneath that reflection was a truth no one could see. He was lonely, broken, and tired of pretending otherwise. He had built an empire from nothing. At 39, he owned multiple companies, hundreds of employees, and a reputation for being one of the most ruthless billionaires alive. They called him the man with a diamond heart, not because it was precious, but because it was cold and unbreakable. Every morning began the same way. His assistant entered with his coffee at 7 a.m. sharp. His board members trembled during meetings. His staff moved like shadows. No laughter, no warmth, only quiet fear. To them, Alexander wasn't human. He was a system, a walking machine powered by profit and precision. He believed that emotions made people weak. He believed that kindness was a luxury only fools could afford. And he believed that money, his money, could buy anything he needed in life. But in chasing power, he had lost something much greater, his heart. That morning, the city below was soaked in rain. The streets glistened like liquid glass as umbrellas danced between flashing car lights. Alexander's phone buzzed constantly with calls, clients, investors, bankers, all demanding a piece of his time. He ignored most of them. He had stopped caring about people a long time ago. He turned away from the window and sat behind his massive oak desk, flipping through papers without really seeing them. Numbers, contracts, signatures, all blending into one endless loop of meaningless success. On his desk was a framed photograph, slightly dusty, of his parents. They had passed away years ago, but he never had the courage to move that photo. It was the last thing that connected him to a version of himself that once smiled. He remembered his mother's words. "Alex, no matter how high you rise, never look down on people. Everyone's fighting a battle you cannot see." He had loved her deeply once, but after losing her, something in him had changed. The warmth she left behind had turned into stone. As he sat there, his secretary entered quietly. "Sir, lunch will be ready soon." "Should I have your meal brought to your office?" He didn't even look up. "Yes, and tell the staff to stay out of sight while I eat." "Yes, sir," she said softly, bowing before leaving. That was how Alexander liked it. Silence. No noise. No people. He couldn't stand small talk or smiles that felt fake. The irony was that everyone around him envied his life. The luxury, the fame, the control. But what they didn't know was that he envied them. Their laughter, their small joys, their families waiting at home. When he went home, he was greeted by silence. A mansion filled with servants, but no love. A dining table that could seat 20, but never held a single conversation. He often told himself, "This is what success feels like." But deep inside, a small voice whispered, "Then why does it feel so empty?" The rain outside grew heavier, beating against the glass like the world was trying to speak to him, to remind him of something he had forgotten long ago. He watched as the city lights blurred through the downpour, looking like broken stars falling into puddles. For a brief moment, Alexander closed his eyes. He could almost hear his mother's laughter, the sound of the small old house where he grew up, where happiness wasn't bought, but made. But just as quickly he forced the memory away. He didn't have time for nostalgia. Not anymore. He picked up his phone, ready to dive back into work, when a faint movement outside caught his eye. Down by the mansion gate, through the sheets of rain, he saw someone standing. A small figure holding an umbrella that looked barely strong enough to stay open. He frowned, leaning closer to the window. It was Maya, one of his maids, the quiet one. She was carrying a lunchbox, her head bowed as she tried to protect her meal from the rain. Something about that sight stopped him. He didn't know why, but for the first time in years, the sight of another human being, small, wet, and alone, stirred something deep in his chest. It wasn't anger. It wasn't curiosity. It was something else. Something he hadn't felt in so long, that he almost didn't recognize it. It was empathy, and as the rain poured harder, Alexander didn't yet realize that this tiny, ordinary moment, a maid eating quietly in the storm, was about to change everything he believed about life, love, and humanity. The rain outside had softened into a steady rhythm, tapping gently against the tall windows of the Reed mansion. Inside, everything gleamed. Marble floors so polished they reflected the chandelier lights, glass walls that captured the lightning like flashes of silver fire. To visitors, this mansion looked like heaven, but for Maya, it felt like another world. A world she was only allowed to serve in, never belonged to. Maya was 26, small in height but strong in spirit. Her hands were rough from years of scrubbing floors and carrying heavy buckets, but her smile still carried light. She was the kind of person who said thank you, even when she had nothing, and sorry even when she wasn't wrong. Every morning, she arrived before sunrise, wearing the same faded blue uniform, her hair neatly tied, her shoes slightly worn. While the other maids chatted softly about their families or weekend plans, Maya mostly stayed quiet, focused, polite, invisible. The staff often wondered about her. She didn't talk about her past, didn't take breaks often, and always carried a small lunchbox that looked far too old to last another day. But what none of them knew, not even Alexander Reed, the billionaire who owned the mansion, was the story behind her silence. Maya came from a small town far from the shining city. Her father had died when she was just 10, leaving her mother sick and her younger sister still a baby. From that day, Maya learned that childhood dreams were a luxury she could no longer afford. While other girls went to school, she went to work, washing dishes, cleaning houses, selling flowers on the street. She used to watch other children laugh as they walked home from school and whisper to herself, "One day maybe my sister will have that life." Years later, when her sister Lena turned 8, Maya moved to the city. She took the first job she could find, cleaning. She didn't care how hard it was, as long as it kept food on their table and medicine for her mother. When she was hired at the Reed mansion, it felt like a miracle. The pay wasn't much, but it was steady, and the house was safe. She remembered her first day and standing at the door, holding her old umbrella as the butler inspected her resume. "You'll serve the master directly," he said sternly. "Mr. Reed doesn't like noise. Keep your head down and your mouth shut." Maya nodded with a smile. "Yes, sir. I just need work." And for 2 long years she kept her promise. Alexander Reed barely knew she existed. He saw her once in a while, silently arranging flowers, cleaning tables, or placing his files on his desk. She always moved quietly, her steps so soft that she almost seemed to float through the halls. If he looked her way, she would lower her gaze immediately. To him, she was part of the background, just another face among dozens of employees who made his life easier. To her, he was someone far beyond her world, a man who could buy anything but never smiled. Yet, Maya never hated him. She used to glance at him from afar sometimes, and though he always looked angry or tired, she sensed something deeper, loneliness. And maybe that's why, even when others whispered about how cold and cruel he was, she never joined them. "He's just forgotten how to feel," she once told another maid softly. People like that need kindness, not judgment. But Maya's kindness often came at a price. She skipped her own lunch breaks to help others. She covered for sick co-workers. She stayed late, polishing floors long after everyone else had gone home. Sometimes, she even refused her share of staff meals, saying, "It's okay. I brought food from home." Her home food was usually just boiled rice or a single piece of bread, but she never complained. She always smiled, saying, "At least I have something to eat." Even on the worst days, when her mother's health bills arrived and her savings disappeared overnight, she found hope in small things. A kind word, a sunset, a prayer whispered before dawn. One rainy afternoon, while the other maids stayed inside the warm kitchen, Maya quietly slipped out toward the gate with her lunchbox. The rain fell softly on her umbrella, dripping through tiny holes. She sat on a small bench outside, her clothes slightly wet, and opened her food, a little rice, a slice of dry bread, and half a banana. As she ate, she smiled to herself. The rain was cold, but the world felt calm. She closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you, God, for this meal." To her, this simple moment, eating under the open sky, was peace. She didn't want to sit inside the mansion, where the rich people dined with gold spoons. She didn't want pity or attention. She just wanted to eat quietly, alone, under the rain that made her feel close to the heavens. Little did she know, someone was watching her from above, someone who had never cared to notice her before. Behind the tall glass window, Alexander Reed stood frozen, staring at the drenched figure sitting by his gate, holding her little lunchbox like a treasure. For the first time, the mighty billionaire couldn't look away. The sight of that small woman, soaked, trembling, yet smiling through the storm, stirred something deep inside him. He didn't know it yet, but the simple image of Maya eating in the rain was about to break through the glass walls he'd built around his heart. The sky had turned into a blanket of grey, heavy with unspoken sorrow. Thunder murmured in the distance as the first drops of rain tapped against the grand glass windows of the Reed mansion, trickling down like tears. Inside, the house was as silent as ever. Cold marble floors, dim golden lights, and an air so still it almost echoed. Alexander Reed sat in his private study, his eyes glued to a tablet filled with numbers and contracts. His assistant's voice buzzed through the intercom. "Sir, the board meeting is confirmed for 4 o'clock. Your driver will be ready in 30 minutes. He didn't reply. He rarely did. He preferred silence. It was the only thing that didn't disappoint him. But that afternoon, silence felt different. It felt heavy. The kind of silence that reminded you how alone you really were. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. His eyes wandered toward the rain-soaked garden outside. The wind bent the trees, and raindrops splashed against the marble statues near the gate. It was a view he had seen 1,000 times, yet somehow, it pulled his attention more than the million-dollar documents in front of him. Something about rain always brought back fragments of memories, his childhood, his mother's laughter, the smell of wet earth near their old wooden home. Back then, he used to love the rain. Now it only reminded him of what he had lost. Just as he was about to turn away, a faint movement near the gate caught his eye. At first, he thought it was one of the guards. But no, this figure was smaller, gentler. He squinted through the raindrops streaking down the glass. There, near the side of the iron gate, sat a woman, Maya, one of his maids, holding an umbrella that looked old and barely holding together. She had a small lunchbox on her lap, and she was eating in the rain, sitting on a low cement ledge, her uniform damp, her shoes soaked, and yet she was quietly smiling as she took slow bites of her meal. Alexander frowned, confused. Why in the world is she eating out there? He stood up and walked closer to the window, pressing his hand against the cold glass. The rain distorted her image slightly, but he could see enough. Her gentle movements, her head bowed in quiet gratitude. She wasn't rushing. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't even trying to stay completely dry. The rain was falling harder now, splattering across her hands and the edge of her lunchbox. Still, she didn't move. She simply shifted a little, trying to cover her meal with her arm. Something about that sight, that quiet dignity in her struggle, hit him in a way he didn't expect. He had seen hundreds of people eat in luxury restaurants, raising glasses of champagne, laughing over meals that cost more than a worker's monthly salary. But never once had he seen someone eat like this, humbly, peacefully, as if even a small meal in the rain was something to be thankful for. Alexander's chest tightened. He turned to the intercom. "Jason," he called out. "Yes, sir?" came his butler's voice. "There's someone outside near the gate." "Why is she sitting there?" Jason hesitated before answering. "That's Maya, sir. She usually eats her lunch outside." "Outside?" Alexander repeated, disbelief lacing his voice. "In this weather?" "Yes, sir. She says she doesn't want to disturb anyone in the staff dining area. She told us once that the smell of her food might not be pleasant for others." Alexander froze. His throat went dry. The smell of her food? That was her reason for sitting in the rain? He turned back to the window. Maya had finished eating half her meal and now sat quietly looking up at the sky, letting the raindrops fall on her face. There was something heartbreakingly peaceful about her expression, as if she had accepted that this was just how life was meant to be. For a long time, Alexander didn't move. He just watched. The sound of the rain became louder, wrapping around him like a distant melody. And for the first time in years, he felt something he couldn't name. Was it guilt? Was it sadness? Or was it the faint stirring of humanity that he had buried long ago beneath piles of money and pride? He remembered his mother's voice echoing softly in his mind, "Alex, when you stop seeing people as people, you lose yourself no matter how rich you become." He clenched his jaw and stepped back, his heart beating faster than usual. This wasn't part of his schedule. He wasn't supposed to care, but he couldn't look away. Through that window, he saw something his billions had never shown him: humility, gratitude, and grace in the face of hardship. As thunder rolled across the sky, a strange thought crossed his mind. She has less than anyone I know, yet she looks more at peace than I've ever felt. The rain poured harder, blurring his view completely, but Alexander didn't return to his desk. He stood there lost in thought. For once, the contracts on his table meant nothing. The deals, the money, the meetings, all of it felt small. He had spent years building walls of glass around himself, thinking he was protecting his heart. But now, watching Maya through that same glass, he realized he had only locked himself in a prison of his own making, and the sight of that small, soaked woman eating her lunch in the rain was the first crack in his cold, glittering cage. That afternoon, something awakened in Alexander Reed, quietly, gently, but unmistakably. He didn't know what it was yet, or where it would lead him, but deep inside, he knew one thing for certain: he could never see the world or the people in it the same way again. The rain had turned from a drizzle into a downpour, washing the streets in silver. Inside the towering mansion, the sound of thunder echoed faintly through the glass halls. But Alexander Reed wasn't thinking about business meetings or profit charts anymore. His eyes were still fixed on that fragile scene outside, a woman eating her lunch under a broken umbrella, drenched, alone, and smiling through it all. He couldn't stop staring. Something about the way she carried herself, calm, almost graceful, even in discomfort, disturbed him. He had spent years surrounded by people who faked smiles in boardrooms, laughed only when he laughed, and worshipped him for his money. But this woman, his maid, was different. She wasn't pretending. She wasn't performing. She was simply being. And somehow that honesty felt like a slap to his soul. "Jason," he said quietly, pressing the intercom again. "Yes, sir? I want you to find out why that woman, Maya, eats out there in the rain. Does she not have a place inside?" The butler paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sir, the staff dining area is available, but Maya prefers to sit outside. She says she doesn't want to disturb others. She also mentioned once that the smell of her food might be unpleasant to the others." "The smell?" Alexander frowned. "What does that mean?" Jason hesitated. "She brings food from home, sir. Simple meals, sometimes rice with lentils, sometimes boiled bread. I think she's—" "Embarrassed." Alexander said nothing, but his jaw tightened. Embarrassed? In his mansion? The thought bothered him in ways he couldn't explain. He turned back to the window. The rain had grown harsher, the drops striking the ground like tiny shards of glass. Maya's umbrella had given up completely now, its metal ribs twisted. She still held it above her lunchbox, as though protecting something precious. Her sleeves were soaked. Her hair clung to her face, but her expression stayed calm, serene, almost grateful. She took her final bite, carefully closed her old metal lunchbox, and placed it inside her bag. Then she pressed her palms together, whispering a silent prayer before standing up. That small gesture, gratitude in the middle of struggle, hit him like lightning. How long had it been since he had thanked anyone for anything? When was the last time he'd smiled without reason, or felt peace that wasn't attached to success? He couldn't remember. He had everything at power, wealth, respect, yet his life felt hollow. And there she was with almost nothing, finding peace in a handful of rice under the rain. Something twisted inside him. Shame, envy and awe all at once. When Maya entered the mansion again, her clothes still damp, the guards tried to stop her. "Miss, you'll catch a cold," one said softly. She smiled politely. "I'm okay. I can't let the master see any mess inside." Then she quietly went to the storage area, picked up her mop and bucket, and continued cleaning the hallway, as if she hadn't just spent her lunch in a storm. Alexander watched her from the staircase above, unnoticed. The way she moved, focused, humble, determined, stirred something deeper in him. This wasn't just a hard-working maid. This was a soul surviving in silence. He remembered firing an employee once for being 2 minutes late. He remembered scolding his driver for sneezing during a meeting. He had been proud of his discipline, proud of being feared. But now, looking at Maya's small frame mopping the wet floor, he felt disgusted with himself. He realized for the first time that fear and respect were not the same. He had forced people to obey him, not because they admired him, but because they were afraid. And yet this woman, this poor, invisible woman, commanded something much greater from him, respect born out of empathy. That night, as the rain continued to fall, Alexander couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the image of Maya eating in the rain replaying in his mind. Why did it bother him so much? Why couldn't he shake it off? He got up, walked to his study, and poured himself a glass of water. Through the glass walls, the city lights flickered like stars drowned in mist. His reflection in the window looked tired, older, heavier. He whispered under his breath, "When did I become this man?" He used to believe emotions were weaknesses. That kindness was a distraction from ambition. But now, for the first time in years, he felt the weight of every cruel decision, every ignored plea, every moment he had chosen profit over people. It wasn't guilt that kept him awake. It was awakening. The next morning, as dawn light spilled through the clouds, he made a quiet decision. He wanted to speak to her, not as an employer, but as a human being. He didn't know what he would say. He only knew he needed to understand. When he arrived at the breakfast table, Maya was already there, silently setting his cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly, but her expression remained calm. Alexander looked at her and said softly, "You were outside yesterday, weren't you?" "Eating in the rain." She froze, eyes wide, unsure if she was in trouble. "I'm sorry, sir," she said quickly. "I didn't mean—" He interrupted gently. "Why?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "It's peaceful out there, sir. I didn't want to disturb anyone." For a long moment, Alexander just looked at her, really looked at her. The lines of exhaustion on her face, the honesty in her eyes. And without realizing it, he said quietly, almost to himself, "No one deserves to eat in the rain." That moment, simple, soft, and unexpected, was the first crack in the armor of the man the world called heartless. He didn't know it yet, but that one sentence would change both their lives forever. The morning after the storm was strangely calm. The sky was clear, but the ground still shimmered with the memory of rain. Drops clung to the rose bushes outside the Reed mansion, glinting like tiny diamonds under the sunlight. Inside, the scent of fresh coffee filled the air, but Alexander Reed's mind was still somewhere else. He couldn't stop thinking about Maya. Her image, sitting in the rain, shielding her meal with her hands, refused to fade. It wasn't pity he felt. It was something heavier, something that made his chest ache in a way he hadn't felt in years. He had seen poverty before. He had donated to charities, funded schools, even spoken at events about helping the less fortunate. But this was different. This wasn't a picture in a brochure or a speech for applause. This was a real human being, living under his own roof, unseen and unheard, and he had ignored her all this time. By noon, he couldn't stay still anymore. He stood near his window again, watching as Maya swept the courtyard. Her movements were slow but graceful, every motion careful, precise. Without thinking, he grabbed his umbrella and stepped outside. The wind greeted him first, soft and cool, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. The sound of his expensive shoes on the stone path made Maya turn abruptly, startled. Her eyes widened as she saw him walking toward her. "Sir," she stammered, clutching her broom nervously. "Is everything all right? Did I do something wrong?" He shook his head, his voice unusually soft. "No, you didn't do anything wrong." She blinked, confused. The great Alexander Reed had never spoken to her beyond a few words. Coffee, clean this, and that's all. And now here he was, standing before her, holding an umbrella over her head. He glanced at her hands, still red from cleaning, rough from hard work. and then at her clothes, still damp from washing the floors earlier. "Why were you eating in the rain yesterday?" he asked, his tone gentle, not accusing. Maya hesitated. "It's okay, sir. I just prefer being outside. It's peaceful." He tilted his head slightly. "Peaceful? While it's raining." She gave a small, awkward smile. "Sometimes the rain makes me feel less lonely, and I didn't want to disturb anyone inside." Her voice trembled just enough for him to notice. He frowned. "You think eating disturbs people?" She shook her head quickly. "No, sir, it's not that. It's just, I bring food from home. It doesn't smell fancy. Some of the others once joked about it. I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable." Her words hit him like a blade twisting quietly in his chest. He was silent for a moment, then asked softly, "What was in the lunchbox?" She smiled faintly. "Just rice and boiled lentils. Sometimes I add half a banana if we have one. For a man who ate at the finest restaurants, whose leftovers cost more than her month's salary." That sentence shattered something inside him. He swallowed hard. "You didn't have to sit out there. You could have eaten in the kitchen." She looked down. "It's all right, sir. I've been through worse. The rain doesn't scare me." That line, "the rain doesn't scare me," re-echoed in his heart. Because for the first time, he realized how different their worlds were. He avoided discomfort at all costs. She endured it every single day and smiled through it. "Maya," he said quietly. "Yes, sir?" He hesitated. The word sorry sat heavy on his tongue, a word he hadn't said to anyone in years. Finally, he took a deep breath. "No one should have to eat in the rain. Not while working for me. I should have noticed." She looked up, eyes wide with surprise. "Sir, you don't have to—" But he interrupted softly. "I do. Because yesterday you reminded me of something I forgot, that people aren't invisible." Her eyes glistened, though she tried to blink the tears away. "You're very kind, sir." He shook his head. "No, I've just been blind." There was a silence between them, not awkward, but heavy with understanding. For the first time, the billionaire and the maid stood on equal ground, two souls separated by wealth, united by humanity. "Come inside," he said finally, motioning toward the mansion. She hesitated. "Sir, I'll get the floor wet." "I don't care," he said, half smiling for the first time in years. Inside, he guided her to the dining area, the one reserved for guests, polished and grand. Maya froze at the doorway. "Sir, I can't sit here." "Yes, you can," he said gently, pulling out a chair. "Today you're not my maid. You're someone I need to learn from." She looked completely overwhelmed, her hands trembling as she sat. The cook, confused, brought out a tray with soup, bread and fruit. Alexander nodded toward it. "Eat, please," her voice shook. "Sir, I can't accept this." He met her eyes, calm but firm. "You've given more to this house than I ever have. You deserve warmth at least once." And as she took the first hesitant spoonful, Alexander watched, not as an employer, but as a man seeing humanity up close for the first time. In that quiet dining room, something unexplainable shifted in him. For years, Alexander Reed had been surrounded by people who flattered his wealth but ignored his soul. But one humble woman, with rain-soaked clothes and a gentle heart, had done what billions couldn't. She had awakened his humanity. That day, as Maya finished her meal with tears in her eyes and gratitude in her heart, Alexander made a silent promise to himself. No one under his roof would ever feel small, unseen, or unworthy again. That evening, the mansion was quieter than usual. The servants moved softly, almost as if they sensed something sacred had shifted within its marble walls. Alexander sat alone in his study, staring at the rain streaks on the glass window, the same rain that had once hidden Maya's quiet meal. Now, every drop carried her reflection in his mind. He couldn't shake off the image of her trembling hands when he'd asked her to eat inside, or the way she had smiled, that gentle, humble smile that somehow held both pain and peace. He needed to understand. So, the next morning, as the sun broke through the clouds, Alexander asked his assistant to send Maya to the garden. When she arrived, she looked uneasy, clutching her apron with both hands. "You called me, sir?" she asked softly. Alexander gestured toward the seat across from him. "Yes, please sit." She froze. "Sir, I shouldn't—" He smiled faintly. You can. I insist. Slowly she sat, her eyes lowered, unsure of what was coming. There was silence for a moment, the kind that held weight, not words. The birds chirped in the distance and a light breeze brushed past them. Then Alexander leaned forward. "Maya," he began, his tone gentle. "Yesterday when you said the rain doesn't scare you, I couldn't stop thinking about that." "What did you mean?" Maya looked down, her fingers tightening around the edge of her apron. "It's just something I tell myself, sir." "Why?" He pressed, but softly. "You don't have to tell me if it hurts, but I want to understand you. You don't have to hide behind that smile anymore." Her lips quivered. She looked away, her eyes glassy. For a moment she said nothing. Then she took a deep breath and whispered, "Because I've lost everything the rain once took from me." Alexander frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" Maya's voice trembled. "When I was 16, my village was hit by a terrible flood. It happened at night. The rain came down so fast it felt like the sky had broken open. My mother kept telling me to run, to take my little brother. But I didn't run fast enough." Her words came in small, shaking pieces like shards of memory cutting through the air. "The river swallowed our house. I remember holding my brother's hand. And then I lost it. When I woke up, I was in a rescue camp. My mother was gone. My brother, too," her voice cracked. She pressed a hand to her chest as tears fell freely now. "I spent days searching. I screamed their names until my voice was gone. But the rain never stopped. It drowned everything. My home, my family, even my hope." Alexander sat completely still, the pain in her words hitting him like thunder. She continued softly, almost in a whisper. "After that I came to the city. I thought I'd start over. I worked wherever I could, cleaning, cooking, washing clothes, anything that could keep me alive. People would call me names, treat me like dirt, but I didn't care. I just needed to survive." She gave a faint smile through her tears. "I learned to smile no matter what. Because if I cried every time life hurt, I'd never stop crying." Alexander's throat tightened. He had spent his life surrounded by comfort, luxury cars, board meetings, expensive suits, yet this woman before him, with nothing but her dignity and strength, had lived through storms he couldn't even imagine. He finally spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "You've been through more than anyone should ever bear, and still you smile." She wiped her tears quickly, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, sir. I didn't mean to—" He interrupted softly. "Don't apologize, Maya, not for your story. You've survived what would have broken most people." They sat quietly for a while. Then Maya said something that struck him deeply. "Sometimes I think the rain took everything from me so I could learn how to give." Alexander looked at her, puzzled. She smiled faintly. "When I see people sad or angry, I try to help, even if it's small. Maybe I clean their room better, or cook a meal they like. I don't have money to give, but I can give kindness. That's something the rain couldn't wash away." Her words sank deep into his heart. For years, Alexander had been praised for his success, for his empire. But at that moment, he realized he had built wealth, not worth. He had gathered power, not peace. And here was a woman who had nothing, and yet somehow, she was richer in soul than anyone he'd ever met. He leaned back slowly, taking in her story. "Maya," he said softly, "I want you to know something. You are not invisible here anymore. And you will never eat in the rain again, not while I'm alive." Maya's lips trembled. "Sir, I don't need—" But he raised a hand gently. "You deserve dignity. You've earned it 1,000 times over." For a long moment, their eyes met, Billionaire and Maid, and between them there was no wealth, no status, no walls, only humanity. The wind rustled through the trees, carrying away the last traces of silence. And as Maya smiled through her tears, Alexander realized something profound. Sometimes, the people who seem the smallest carry the biggest stories, and those stories can change even the coldest hearts. The next few days in the Reed mansion felt different, lighter, warmer, alive. The air no longer carried the sharp silence of authority. Instead, laughter could be heard in small corners, soft, hesitant at first but real. And at the center of it all was Alexander Reed. The billionaire who once lived behind glass walls now spent his mornings walking through the gardens, greeting the workers, asking questions he'd never asked before. "How are you today? Did you have breakfast? Do you need help with anything?" Those simple words shocked everyone, because until recently, Alexander Reed had been known as a man of few words and fewer emotions, but something inside him had shifted. The night after Maya told him her story, Alexander couldn't sleep. He had paced his study, staring at the portraits on his wall, reminders of a legacy built on ambition, power, and pride. He saw a version of himself he didn't like anymore. He realized he had spent years building towers but never bridges. He had wealth beyond measure, yet his heart was bankrupt. And that night, he decided it was time to rebuild not his business, but his humanity. The next morning, Alexander called a meeting, not in his sleek corporate boardroom, but in the large hall of his mansion. Every worker, from cooks to gardeners, maids to drivers, was invited. They entered nervously, whispering to each other. Many had never even seen him up close before. When Alexander walked in, he didn't wear his usual suit. He wore a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, and a calm expression that almost looked human. "Good morning," he began, his voice clear but gentle. "I've realized something I should have known long ago. This house, this company, none of it works without you." The workers looked stunned. Some exchanged uncertain glances, unsure if they'd heard right. He continued, "For years I've been blind to your struggles. I thought paying salaries was enough. But I see now that respect is more valuable than money, and kindness is more powerful than authority." He paused, taking a breath. "From today, things will be different." He announced new changes. Every worker would have proper meal breaks, warm places to eat, fair wages, and health care. The mansion would build a resting lounge and dining area just for them, a place of dignity, not hierarchy. And finally, his voice softened. "No one in my home or my company should ever feel invisible again." There was silence. Then slowly a few people began to clap. Within seconds, the room filled with applause, not out of formality, but gratitude. And standing in the back, Maya covered her mouth with her hands, tears welling in her eyes. That day marked the beginning of something beautiful. Alexander didn't just make promises, he kept them. He visited his factories unannounced, not to scold but to listen. He learned workers' names, their stories, their families' struggles. He built small schools near his company sites so their children could study for free. And he launched a new foundation in his mother's name, Hearts in the Rain, to help flood victims and underprivileged women. Inspired by Maya's story, the media began to notice. Headlines appeared. Billionaire Reed launches foundation after meeting with Maid, from cold to compassionate, the man who changed overnight. But Alexander didn't care about the fame. For the first time, he cared about meaning. Maya's life changed too. Alexander promoted her, not because of pity, but because of trust. She became the house supervisor, responsible for overseeing the comfort and welfare of all staff. At first she protested. "Sir, I'm not educated enough for this." But he smiled. "You have more wisdom than any degree could offer." Slowly, Maya began to believe it too. She carried herself differently now, still humble, but with quiet confidence. She made sure every new maid had proper meals, rest, and respect. She treated everyone the way she wished she'd been treated when she first came to the city, and Alexander often watched from afar, a proud smile on his face. One afternoon, as the first spring rain began to fall, Alexander found Maya standing near the same garden where she once ate her lonely meal. But this time she wasn't alone. The staff had gathered under a new shelter he'd built, a cozy corner with wooden benches, warm tea and laughter. He walked toward her, holding an umbrella. "You still like watching the rain?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, sir. But now it feels different. The rain used to remind me of loss. Now, it reminds me of kindness," he smiled softly. "And you taught me what that word really means." For a moment, neither spoke. The rain tapped gently on the umbrella above them, and Alexander realized this was peace. Not the peace money could buy, but the kind that comes from healing a heart. As the sun broke through the clouds again, Alexander looked around. His mansion no longer felt like a fortress. It felt like a home. Every face he saw wasn't an employee. It was a story, a soul, a reason to care. And deep down, he knew one truth that would stay with him forever. Sometimes it takes a storm to awaken a heart, Sometimes, all it takes is one humble soul to remind a billionaire what it means to be human. Years passed. The Reed mansion, once a symbol of wealth and power, now stood as a monument of compassion. The walls that had once echoed with silence now carried laughter, conversations, and music. The air was lighter, because within those walls humanity had found a home. Alexander Reed was no longer the cold billionaire people once whispered about. He had become something far greater, a man respected not for his riches but for his heart. Every morning, he still began his day the same way, walking through the gardens with a cup of tea in hand, stopping to greet the workers, asking about their families, their health, their dreams. He no longer saw employees. He saw people, and every time it rained he'd pause, look up at the sky, and smile, remembering the day it all began. Maya still worked in the mansion, though her role had changed completely. She was no longer the maid. She was now the manager of welfare for all of Alexander's estates and foundation projects, overseeing hundreds of workers, ensuring each one was treated with dignity and fairness. But despite her new position, Maya never lost her humility. She still helped in the kitchen sometimes, still listened to others' problems, still offered her gentle smile, the same smile that once hid her pain, but now radiated peace. To everyone, she was more than a manager. She was a story, a reminder that no matter how small you start, kindness can take you farther than money ever could. One afternoon, Alexander invited Maya to his office. The foundation, Hearts in the Rain, had just completed its 5th year. "Do you remember," he asked, "the first time we talked about the rain?" Maya smiled softly. "I'll never forget, sir," he chuckled. "You called me sir then too," she laughed shyly. "Old habits." He looked at her kindly. "You've changed my life, Maya. But more than that, you've changed the meaning of this company, of everything I thought success was." Maya lowered her eyes humbly. "No, Mr. Reed, you changed yourself. I just reminded you where to look." He nodded slowly, feeling the truth in her words. Later that week, Alexander attended a charity event hosted by the foundation. The hall was filled with people, workers, students, mothers, and families who had lost everything to floods but were now rebuilding their lives through his programs. One young girl walked up to the stage, her eyes shining. "Because of Hearts in the Rain, I go to school now," she said proudly. "I want to become a teacher, like the kind my village never had." The crowd applauded, but Alexander's eyes went straight to Maya. She stood quietly at the back, tears glistening, hands folded, and in that moment, Alexander realized something profound. His greatest wealth was not in banks, but in hearts he had touched. Months later, during another rainy afternoon, Alexander's health began to falter. Years of stress and age had caught up with him. But even from his hospital bed, he remained calm, peaceful, and smiling. Maya visited him every day, bringing flowers from the garden. He would joke softly, "Ah, the rain again. Seems it never leaves us." And she would reply with her gentle grin, "That's because it's part of our story now." One day, as the rain drummed gently outside his window, Alexander looked at her and whispered, "Promise me something." "Anything," she said quietly. "Keep this alive. The kindness, the care, the way this house changed. Never let it end with me." Maya held his hand tightly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I promise, Mr. Reed. As long as there's rain, your kindness will live on." He smiled faintly, closing his eyes. "Then I can rest easy." When Alexander Reed passed away a few weeks later, the world mourned, not just a billionaire, but a man who had learned what it truly meant to live. His funeral was unlike any other. There were no extravagant decorations, no golden coffins, only a simple wooden casket surrounded by people from every walk of life. Factory workers, maids, children, flood survivors, and business partners standing side by side. They all had stories of how one man's heart had changed their world, and when the first drops of rain began to fall, no one ran for cover. Instead, Maya stood in front, umbrella in hand, looking up at the grey sky with tears in her eyes and whispered, "The rain doesn't scare me anymore, because this time, it didn't bring pain and it brought memories, hope, and the gentle reminder that compassion never dies." Years later, people would visit the Hearts in the Rain Center, where a bronze statue stood in the garden, a figure of a man holding an umbrella over a seated woman. At the bottom, engraved in gold, were the words, He learned humanity from the one the world ignored, dedicated to Alexander Reed and Maya, whose kindness changed lives forever. Every time it rained, droplets would slide down the statue's bronze surface, glimmering under the soft light, as if the sky itself was paying tribute, and children playing nearby would often ask, "Who are they?" And someone would always answer with a smile, "They're the ones who taught the world that even a billionaire can cry, and a maid can heal a heart." True richness doesn't come from what we own, but from what we give, and sometimes all it takes is one simple act of kindness to awaken the sleeping heart of the world.